Okay, we'll open the meeting. Get a roll call, please.
Yes.
Council McLaughlin.
Present.
Council, yeah. Council DePerio.
Present.
Please stand and salute the flag, please.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. You can do the
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to appoint Mr. Sergio Cornelio, temporary clerk of committees this evening.
Second motion.
Okay, all in favor?
All right.
All opposed? Ayes have it. I have two regrets before we start the meeting tonight. Councilor Wayne Matusky was unable to attend, and Councilwoman Rose DeFloria was unable to attend also.
Ask me to roll.
Mr. Chairman, on the motion.
I have the chairman, city clerk, please read the one piece for tonight.
Sorry. I didn't hear you. Item number 1, Mr. Chairman, is in order to authorize a city building revolving fund for the purpose of funding related to maintenance of city buildings. Invited guests are Mr. Eric Demas and George Lean of the Building Department.
The invited guests to come up and please state their name and position.
Mr. Chairman, can we also invite up Mayor DeMaria's Chief of Staff, Kevin O'Donnell, please?
Just
Good
state your name
evening,
and
Eric
position.
Demas, CFO.
Good evening, Kevin O'Donnell, Chief of Staff.
Good evening, gentlemen. Council McLaughlin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I just want Mr. Demas to kind of explain to us where we are at this point. So last Monday night, we had the council meeting, and privy to my knowledge, this became kind of a fast-paced item that we had to push forward. What was the reason for it? Is there a timeline on something outstanding, or?
The reason for the time frame is that we're currently in the process of finalizing a lease agreement with a tenant at the old high school. And in order to execute that lease agreement, there are some changes to a certain portion of the building to accommodate their needs. And as such, what we wanted to do, rather than to use city funds and, from facilities maintenance's appropriation, we wanted to utilize the money that we're generating from that lease to make those accommodations, some of which are cosmetic, some of which are safety concerns, and some are general maintenance.
Okay. Is there any, so Mr. Demas, the lease is hinged on this appropriation of a revolving account established? Is that correct? So this lease cannot go forward if this revolving account is not established and put into place?
If this revolving account is established and put into place, it's going to make things a whole lot easier to get the accommodations made to the building, but I don't think it would necessarily hold up the lease itself.
So can you, I'm sorry, go ahead, I'm sorry.
The way the lease has been drafted is that the leasee doesn't have the ability to make an upfront payment to make the accommodations on their own. Typically, something like that would happen is they would make an upfront gift, if you will, and then we would utilize those funds. Because of the stipulations on the leasee's funding source, they don't have the ability to do that. So as such, what we did was we incorporated the costs required to make those accommodations, as including the safety upgrades, into the operating lease itself.
Okay. So can you explain to me, Mr. Demas, what happens if this does, so you said that this basically it speeds up the process, makes it easier. What happens if this is not created? What is the process at that point?
Currently, the facilities maintenance budget, we don't have a line item for it to make those capital purchases. There are certainly line items available. However, when we put that budget forth, they were set aside to do specific items that were planned for this year. So if we were to utilize those funds, we would have to put off other projects that were worked into this year's budget.
Which would be what? So I'm trying to get to the baseline of the fact that if this doesn't happen, does this lease become null and void? Where there's a missing link here for me. I know, I'm sure that you didn't negotiate this lease intentionally thinking that there was going to be no funding available. But something missed a loop here. So if we put the money forward
Well,
for this, what are we taking away from that's already appropriated through capital improvement plan?
Well, that's why I was hoping George Wayne would be here to tell you what he has for projects
Yep.
already specified.
Yep.
I can't list those specifically, but they were included when we went through the annual appropriation. Now, what I can tell you is it's not just capital related. We are going to be experiencing some increased operating costs, such as overtime, cleaning, and the such, that at the time we put the budget forth, we didn't anticipate executing this lease. We didn't anticipate these executed costs.
That's why I'm wondering if we should even be talking about this lease if we haven't fully planned for this at this point. We're taking away from something to pay for something. What that something is, we don't know at this point. It's an unknown factor.
Well, actually, if the council
isn't
actually
created.
adopted this, then we wouldn't be taking anything away, and as the budget was presented, everything would go forth as planned. And the money that would be received from the lease would be funding the additional costs that we'd be experiencing. However, the purpose of this revolving fund is that the money that's going to be generated is going to be far in excess of what our additional operating and capital build-out costs or accommodations that need to be made. So what this does is money that's being generated in excess of what our additional operating and accommodation costs are going to be, we can use to utilize to make improvements within that building itself at the old high school. But currently, there are a number of projects that are going on. The school department's in there. They have a certain wing. The fire department is in there as Hancock renovations are going on. In addition to that, we have the gym. And I know you've been in that building. It has been neglected for a number of years and certainly can use a significant amount of increased maintenance to help ensure that we utilize that building moving forward. One of the items that is major projects that's going to be done as part of that building as we plan to utilize that building is we're replacing the boiler this year. And that boiler was included and appropriated and approved by City Council as part of the CIP process. So our plans are fully to utilize that building. And if we have empty space that we have a potential leasee that wants to utilize that and we can generate some income at the same time that we can use to put towards that building, I don't see where the missing link is. To me, it
Why
makes
can't
sense and it's good for the city.
This is news. I'm concerned about spending good money into I wouldn't call it a bad building, but into a shaky situation. That building, if you've toured it as both of you guys have, there is a severe lack of maintenance that have been done over the last several years because I think the intention was to do something different with that building. So why were we going there year after year and continue to spend good money? And now it seems like that's the plan, is to start putting money back into this building that's sort of on, not exactly great grounds, if you will. I'm still done if you want to speak on that, Shisha.
Well, I just want to add that the beauty of this revolving account would allow, there's not real major needs for the leasee in terms of what they need for their space, but they're, not only would they offset any costs that they would have, but it also generates income for us to maintain that building at a higher level without using our own resources.
But I would really like to hear from the mayor on what his plan is with that building overall. We still haven't heard any concrete plans from the mayor on that building. So now we're going to go in there, start leasing out this section of the building, renting out another section possibly, do the wellness center on the first floor, and the old field house, which is a great program, no question. You're going to start chopping up this building into all these different avenues. But the mayor still hasn't come forward and explained to us what his overall intention or plan is with this building, which is what I would really like to hear, because I think spending good money into a shaky situation is not the smartest idea at this point. in that shaky situation is, what if we spend this money and a year after that lease is over, or whatever that value of that lease is, they walk out, and now we have to go find another tenant to be able to occupy that space. It's a revolving situation that is not in great intention. Go ahead, Mr. Michelle.
The only thing I just wanted to add, just 2 points. Number one, if the leasee actually does leave after the end of the year, there will be no increased costs because we will not have any, the build-out will have been done of which they would have financed, and we wouldn't be experiencing any increased operating costs such as custodial and cleaning because that portion of the building would be vacant. So we wouldn't be increasing costs in the future. Number two, this revolving fund is exactly like the school revolving fund for school rental of buildings. So it's not just, if your concern is that building, it's not just that building itself. If we were to rent out
I
a
agree
portion of the library,
Absolutely.
and we had somebody that came in that wanted to do something, and we were going to charge them for it, we don't have those funds budgeted in the appropriation. What this mechanism does, which is why the state legislature created this, is in situations like that, we rent out the library, we know that we're going to have overtime if we're going to do it for a night, some major event. This allows us to take those funds in and utilize those funds to cover those increased operating costs of which we wouldn't have anticipated. So it's not necessarily just the old high school, I don't know if that helps, but it would cover all of our city buildings where we did have situations like
No,
this.
it does. And we talked about what potential city buildings would have rentable space that would be, and there's only, I think, 2 additional beyond the Everett High School, right? The Conley Center, and now that the Recreation Center is back up and running, the Recreation Center would be the 2 primary other facilities that would be leasable or rentable.
Or I could also see like the library as well,
Okay.
one of the libraries as well, having an event there.
But more often than not, it would be those 2 buildings, the Rec Center and the Conley Center.
I think that's fair to say that that would be the bulk of the activity, Kevin.
Yeah, yeah.
And if we were putting money into those 2 buildings, I'd feel a lot different than putting money into the old Everett High School right now until we hear the sentiment of the mayor of what his overall plan is. And we've heard, for many years, a lot of different potential ideas with the old Everett High School, whether it be becoming a municipal building, a lot of different ideas. But at this point, we don't have any ground of where the administration is going with this.
Sure.
But the thing being, Council, with this revolving account is we wouldn't be putting money, any city monies into it. The lease would be a self-sustaining operation of which we would probably have some extra at the end of the day. It would be offsetting all the potential costs.
But it would be city funded, because if you were to take the money from the Conley Center or the Recreation Center and you were to be able to put that back into, presumably that it goes into general fund at the end of the year, correct, Mr. Demus? The rental, currently, the way the rentals come in, they go back into general fund as of now.
That is correct. Any of these rentals would go into the general fund. However, what I would say, though, is especially
So let me
towards...
just finish my point, I'm sorry. So if you were to just put that money back into the general fund, then you're expending money out for the old Everett High School. There's no ratio at that point of controlling what's coming in versus what's going back out. We're just paying the bills of the renovations that we want to do. So that it really is not a controlled balance of knowing where the funds are going. So we can't say that we're not spending any money, city monies, on the old Everett High School.
Well, the only thing I just wanted to add to that, and you're absolutely correct. If we were to enter into a lease or if we did a one-time event, any of those funds would be generated, would go into the general fund. However, again, when we do these types of events or we do this type of lease, there are costs associated. And even if it was to say, let's say the library or the recreation center where we rented it out for, say the recreation center, we rented it out for 4 Saturdays in a row. If we were at the end of the year and we didn't allocate or we didn't budget for those, we probably wouldn't be able to rent that out, and because the funds would be generated, but we wouldn't have the appropriation to actually cover the overtime or the operating costs for these items that were not budgeted for. So without this mechanism, there would be the potential that we couldn't utilize or allow a certain function to go through. The only other thing that I just wanted to add, and I added it, I just wanted to make sure that we're clear on it, is that Mass General Law is also very specific. We are not allowed to ever deficit spend. So if the monies are not generated, they wouldn't be spent.
No, but we have seen budget year after budget year, long before you were here, Mr. News, and long before I was a city councilor, movement of line items throughout the year at the end of the budget session. We've talked about that at each budget session, of funds being transferred from one line item to another line item to offset over expenditure or whatever the case might be, because something happened throughout the course of the year or whatever, and they had enough money in the budget for that office to be able to transfer that money
Sure.
at the end of the year. And we've talked about that many times at budget season, that, going line item by line item in the budget isn't always the true numbers, because the overall number could be shifted in a department in a different way, whether it were to be for additional office supplies or anything, overtime for some specific thing that might come up throughout the course of the year that you don't anticipate in June. A million things could happen, and we see that year after year in the
Yep.
budget.
And we have had those talks, and I think you also noted, and you actually pointed out that this year, my first full year here, they were significantly less than
I
they have
agree
in the
whole-
past.
I agree
And
wholeheartedly.
my
Absolutely.
goal is to try to avoid that and to put forth a budget that is an accurate, reflective budget of where we're spending our money.
Nope, and I
as we
couldn't agree
made,
more with
and
you.
as we made numerous cuts in this year's budget, before we even had presented to council, that when the mayor went through and made those cuts, and we went line by line by line, because of that, we actually don't have the ability and we don't have the flexibility in this year's budget to go through, to have facilities or to hire an outside contractor to make these accommodations.
So my concern
this
is-
mechanism would
My
allow
concern
us
is-
to do that.
Mr. Demus, and I'm going to yield the floor to my colleagues, and I'm going to circle back. But my concern is that it almost feels like we're being not pressured into this vote, but almost told that if this vote doesn't happen on Monday night, that this lease doesn't happen. So it's up to the city council whether or not we basically want to negotiate into this lease, because there's no other option, for this mechanism to happen. So I almost feel like the administration and Mr. O'Donnell do a great job communicating with us. There's no question about that. But somebody should have came to the table at the beginning and talked to us about this if this was going to be the process that was going to have to take place. Now we're at the 11th hour. We need to get this money appropriated to be able to do these renovations, to be able to get this lease signed and get this contract in place. So it's now up to the city council to either show good faith and make this vote, or this lease walks away.
The only thing I just want to
Do you
add.
agree with that statement, though, Mr. News? Do you agree that we should maybe
Not
put the
in
horse
full.
before the cart a little bit on this? Because
Not in full, and here's why I'm going to
Okay,
address
sure,
that.
absolutely.
As I've been here, I've been putting forth numerous policies, and I've been bringing forth, like the OPEB trust fund. This is something I would have presented to city council absent of this lease. As I'm going through and looking at our charter and looking at our ordinances and looking at Mass General laws, finance Mass General laws, as well as the changes from the Municipal Modernization Act, I was actually surprised that the city hadn't already had one of these revolving funds, because most communities do for this specific example.
Any surrounding communities around here that have them? That
I would be
look at it?
surprised if they wouldn't, but I'd be happy to get you a list.
I'd like to see the communities that have them so that we can see how they actually function. And if you thought that this would have come before us before the lease in place, is there any other ideas of this magnitude in the back of your mind that you're thinking that we should do, and any other buildings that we should start discussing now before a last minute?
I'm not prepared to answer that. I would be happy to give some thought and to provide that response to you. The only thing I want to say, though, to add is that the city actually already has this revolving fund for the school buildings. So I was actually surprised that they didn't have it for
Honestly,
the
I
city
respect
buildings.
that, but it's six half dozen the other. I can't control what's already been on the books before I became an elected official.
Fair enough.
I'm accountable, as my colleagues are, as the mayor is, to the taxpayers of the city. We need to make sure that we're spending their money wisely, and we're making sure that we're making every best effort to keep cost as reasonable as possible. That being said, I'm going to yield the floor to my colleagues, and I'm going to return back with some follow-up questions.
Council DePiero?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't really have any questions, just more about my feelings on the fund itself. I understand my colleague, Councilor McLaughlin's feelings and opinion about the old high school building, but let's face it, the building's not going anywhere. Whether the mayor has plans to develop it or not, it could be a year before we get those plans. It could be 10 years before the administration has plans for that specific site. The building's being used currently. We have Everett students in that building, public school students. And just aside from the old high school, we can't hold up the maintenance of our other buildings and assets because we don't know what's going to go on with one. We have to reinvest in our buildings. I'm a big fan of reinvesting in your infrastructure, whether it's your streets, city buildings. I think you need to maintain your assets and keep them to where they need to be. This just makes sense to me. It's not taking money from somewhere, it's reinvesting the money the building generates back into the building. So it only makes sense to me to have this type of account where, even if you didn't give me a list, Mr. Demas, I would assume that other cities do have this type of account. It just doesn't leave us scrambling when emergencies happen and certain instances trying to come up with the money, take from here, take from there. You have money there to use it when it's needed, and I think it's the smart thing to do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Councilor McLaughlin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wholeheartedly agree with Council President Tapera. I'm a full support of putting money back into infrastructure in the city, whatever aspect of that is, as long as the city council has involvement on and some say on those projects, and we do a capital improvement. This revolving account, in all due respect, we don't have a new building on the books, right? We have exactly the same amount of buildings that we've had forever. We've never had needed this fund previously to today. And we've had these buildings for 100 years, and they've never been a need for this fund. So to create this fund today, there is something that has changed somewhere along the lines to make this fund needed today. Invest in our infrastructure all day long, you'll have my support. But to lay it out on the table during capital improvement, this takes the hands of the city council away from these types of projects, and we talked about that at the council meeting. It's just a mechanism, unfortunately, to kind of avoid the involvement of the city council. I want to get more involved in the city, more involved in what's going on in the city, not less involved. And this is one of those things that I really believe supersedes that. And you can speak, Mr. Demas, sure.
Thank you. The only thing I do just want to remind you, because we did have this conversation, is that this requires a city council annual appropriation every year, just like the budget does, just like the CIP does.
At the end of the year, after the funds are spent.
No, at the beginning of the year. At the
Okay.
beginning year before the funds are spent.
Okay.
You reauthorize it every
Yep,
year.
absolutely, for
There-
the up to 200,000, right?
Yes.
And then after that, the 200,000 is spent throughout the year in the way that Mr. Lane or the administration sees fit at that point.
Only if we generated, see, that's what I'm trying to say.
Well,
You're not authorizing any tax dollars to spend 200,000. If we only take in 60, then the limit would be $60,000.
We both know that we're gonna get to close to the 200,000, and we may not hit the.
I don't know
We may
that.
not hit the goal. Well, we're at 60,000 from jump with just this one lease. Additional rentals that happen, the recreation gets rented a lot when it's in full use, and now due to the, good work of the administration, the rec center is back up and running again. That building is going to get a lot of use over the next several years, especially with the amenities that are being put in, even with the new bathrooms in the gymnasium and so forth. That is additional funding that is going to be brought there. Yeah, absolutely. You can.
You actually raise a very good point, and I'm glad you brought that up in regards to the recreation center. One of the concerns the council has had is the condition that the bathrooms were in down there. And the council wanted something done, and they wanted improvements done to the bathroom, as well as that whole entry area. Well, it didn't get done for a significant period of time, for a number of months, and that's not because we didn't want to get it done. That's because we didn't have the appropriation to get it done. And what we were doing is I was working with George, and George was new at the time, and we would sit and have meetings to figure out what projects he had going on, where his fires were, and what we needed to do. And we had to wait till the end of the year to see where some of those things were going to play out. Had this fund been in place, then you would have been able to utilize, George would have been able to specifically utilize those funds to do those bathrooms, and we would not have had to wait.
But we both know that if you would come before the city council at any time with an appropriation for X amount of dollars to do the renovation of the bathrooms, whether it's next week, next month, or next year, we would have voted because it was the right thing for the people of the city to be able to do the bathrooms in the lobby area over for this. We have a lot of free cash. An appropriation of that magnitude makes sense. It makes sense for all of Everett to be able to do that over, to be able to re-enhance that building and make it more friendly, user-friendly. And kudos to the administration for jumping on that. Councilor Della Sola and I brought it to the attention of the administration. The mayor was already aware of it. He agreed immediately with us to work on that with us, right? But we didn't need this fund to be able to do that project because you could have came to us at any time and said we need 50,000 or 30,000 or whatever that number is to be able to do this over, and I can guarantee you would have had support of the city council because it was a project that made sense. This allows Mr. Lane or whomever, and I don't want to blame Mr. Lane, but whomever it is, to solely make decisions of what projects make sense throughout the year.
Two things.
Up to $200,000.
First, I can tell you that it does not give Mr. Lane sole authority to decide what projects he's going to do.
I'm sure it does.
They will go through the chief of staff and through the mayor.
Absolutely.
The other
And
piece.
that's the problem.
The other piece that I just want to make sure is you're focusing on the capital. I don't envision any significant capital improvements being done or being funded through this fund. And the reason being is we define any type of capital improvements in excess of $35,000. So for example, the recreation bathrooms, I believe the
When
cost.
you may come through here then.
Well, they wouldn't because they were like $25,000 is what George had anticipated for them. So that's what we're pretty much going to spend is 25.
I thought it was over 30. I thought it was a little higher.
Well, I think you guys were asking for
So I
the
think-
entryway.
So-
But the other piece, just to point out, is we do have increased operating and maintenance costs of these buildings when
Yep.
we do have these activities go on.
Absolutely.
And those, it's not so much being able to come to the council and say, can we have 25, 30? 25 was, I think, the original number. I think he ran into some plumbing issues, so I think you're right, it went a little bit higher. But we don't have the ability to do the additional
operate. Been involved in this account. That project would have been taken out and would have been put into capital improvement anyhow because the cost was higher than the 35 cap that you just alluded to, that you just discussed.
Right.
So that wouldn't even came into play into this project.
Well, also the
This
goal.
is basically gives you guys up to $200,000 a year to be able to make sole decisions on what you guys feel. And I'm sure it's in good faith. I'm not doubting the fact that these buildings need X, Y, and Z maintenance or X, Y, and Z projects, but it gives you guys sole authority to be able to make what decisions you think should be done in these buildings in no involvement of the city council throughout the year. That's a concern to me.
The other thing, just to add, is that the goal is to not allow these buildings to get to the point where we have to go through and do major rehabs. What this fund would do would also allow us to be able to maintain existing maintenance requirements, existing overtime costs for these types of activities. That's primarily where the funds are going to be spent. The only reason why I even put the word capital in it is because if these funds did get to the level that we had the ability to do the recreation bathrooms, we did want that flexibility. But I don't actually envision us funding these major capital projects. What I envision is the majority of this is going to be, for the most part, general maintenance, covering overtime costs, cleaning, that sort of thing. I don't envision it coming to the level of these major capital projects that I think you're envisioning. And certainly if they do, we go before council every year with this. And at the same time, when we do,
But
we
you've already
report.
spent the money at that point, though, Mr. Demas. You've already spent the money at that point. So at that point, you might as well not come before the council. It means nothing at that point. Because the money's already gone, the money's already expended. You can't take the money back for projects. You can't tell them to take the wall down that you built because the city council doesn't support it. So the money's already expended.
Again, the majority of the funds that are going to be expended
And
from this
what-
newly created funds would be
And-
operating.
And at what point does operating funds make sense and don't make sense for maintenance of a lease at $60,000 at the end of the year? At what point does maintenance or upkeep of a lease make sense and doesn't make sense? That's you guys' sole decision at that point to be able to make operating cost expenditures.
I would agree that
doesn't-
that's an executive function, yes.
But, okay, fine, no problem at all. I respectfully disagree, but that's okay. At that point, there's no additional funding for a capital improvement plan. or for a bigger or a larger project.
I don't understand what you're talking
So
about.
if you spend three-quarters of the $200,000 on operational expenditures, and then you need to, then something happens throughout the course of the year, and you need to do a bigger project. You've now spent two-thirds of that account on operational budget.
I'm really not following you because, again, the purpose of this fund would be to utilize any rental activity to help. The majority of the funds are going to be spent on operational. So I don't know what you mean we're going to be running out of funds to do capital-related projects. All of our capital-related projects that we have planned are in the CIP that's being presented.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah,
Mr.
can-
Chairman, through the...
Counselor,
Before we continue, I'm sorry to interrupt. It's 6:30.
Yes, correct.
I'm going to ask the chairman to take a 2-minute recess. I'm going to open the meeting that I legally have to open in the back room.
No,
I
I'm
will
actually
ask
gonna-
them to take a recess. He has questions also.
Mr. Clerk.
So
excuse me.
I have to legally
Okay,
open
but I
that
have
meeting
a-
at 6:30.
Okay, I have a better idea. I'm gonna make a motion that we keep this in committee, and we don't send it out to the council tonight, because there are additional questions. You have additional questions, Councilor
yeah,
Delasola?
I don't mind waiting till after we get the workshop going up.
But we have other members in the audience tonight that are here for an additional meeting. It's not fair to them.
That's
So I'd
fine.
make a motion that, and I have to attend that
Yeah.
other meeting. I'd make a motion that we leave this in committee, and that we don't send it out to the council, and have
Can I ask
another
if
committee
there's no
meeting so that we
second?
can continue to ask questions. I
There's a-
have several more questions that I'd like to
There's a motion on the
discuss.
table. If it's seconded, we have to take it. I don't hear a second, Mr. Chairman. So I would ask you again to take a 2-minute recess so that I can open the other meeting, ask that membership to close the meeting indefinitely until I come back, if that's okay.
It's not okay.
Well, it's up to the chairman, so it's okay as long as the chairman states it. Mr. Chairman?
In behalf of everybody what's going on tonight, I will second that motion, because it'll be a long night, and it's not fair to our colleagues that are here waiting for this. So I'll second that motion to keep it into committee, and we'll have to revisit this again.
Take a roll.
Will this, before
I'm
I
gonna
do
call the
this, will this affect anything by us waiting to another meeting?
I defer to Mr. O'Donnell on that question because I wasn't privy to.
I think
the lease.
conversation is over. The vote has been taken.
Well, on the motion, you're allowed to speak on the motion.
Okay.
So on the motion, the chairman asked on the
Mr. Chairman,
motion,
can I
is this
speak on the
going to
motion,
affect
please?
it? I think that's in line, so I would say that the chief of staff can answer that.
Will us delaying this, will this affect the lease or anything? Because the lease, it's a big lease. So will this affect anything with the lease if you hold us over to the next committee meeting?
It could slow down the process, but I don't think that the lease would stop.
I mean, yeah, we would still go forward, because we have a commitment, with the signed lease. We're just trying to put this mechanism in place in order to offset those initial costs. Like, for example, if the rec center is up and running and a basketball program wants to rent that, as we've done in the past, we use those rental fees to offset the fact that we have to have facilities maintenance people there to open the doors, to turn on the lights, to clean up after, secure the buildings and things like that. These are all just costs to offsetting that don't come out of our pocket. That's the purpose of this account.
This is ridiculous.
Just one more comment to my colleagues here, then we're gonna get moving here. If we accept this in a committee, it's just referral to our next council meeting.
But I don't think it should be hashed out on the floor of the council. I think it should be hashed out in committee. That's why we have committees. We have committees to be able to do stuff like we're doing tonight.
This isn't gonna affect it.
It's not really going to. Mr. O'Donnell just explained that it could potentially, but I'm sure we'll have a meeting before there was any, we can call a committee meeting at any time, if need be. So I don't see there being a problem with laying this in committee. for
All right,
another
I'll second
meeting.
Council McLaughlin's motion.
All those in favor to refer to to lay this over in committee? Aye, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
All right.
You have you have laid it over to the next Ways and Means Committee.
Motion to adjourn, Mr. Chairman?
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Ayes have it. Thank you, gentlemen.